Welcome back to All Things Creepy. I'm your host, Micah James. And this week is definitely going to be a shorter episode because not only is my episode late, but just due to ongoing things happening in my life right now, it was just really hard for me to sit down and write a full script. But this is a topic that I've been wanting to cover, so I'm going to talk about it. And that is the topic of the Cecil Hotel. Now, this is definitely one of the more popular topics, like in general, when it comes to like hauntings and just scary hotels in general. A lot of other podcasts have covered it to some extent, same with TV shows. I know that Netflix has a series about one specific case, which I'll touch on very super briefly a little bit later on. I shouldn't say I know, but I think Hulu has a show called Haunted America, something along those lines, or Most Haunted Places in America, and I think they have an episode about the Cecil Hotel. And I know last podcast on the left briefly covered it. I know, and That's Why We Drink covered it. But like there's a lot of places that you can get like a more in-depth dive into the Cecil Hotel. But I just wanted to cover, some basic history of the hotel and some incidents that happen in the hotel's history that I found interesting. So let's start off with the history of the hotel, like a brief history of the hotel. So the Cecil is located in downtown LA and opened in either 1925 or 1927 near a road called Skid Row. Now, the reason why I say 1925 or 1927 is because I found like a few sources that kind of had conflicting information about when it opened. But either way, that was right before the Great Depression, which hit in 1929. So, because it opened right before the Great Depression, people later on said that it was just cursed from the beginning, that this hotel was just not going to do great, or at least like bad things were going to happen with this hotel. And that's kind of true, which again, I'll cover in a minute. It was advertised as like this middle class hotel. Like it was supposed to be like this hotel that had like a higher end feel to it, but the guy who built it wanted it to be more affordable to the middle class and wanted the middle class to have experience like some sort of luxury like the rich were able to afford. Now, through it closed down for a little bit because of the Great Depression, and it did eventually open back up. They did try to make it a hotel once before, I believe, but then in the 70s, it got turned into a protected low-income housing as the neighborhood took a downward spiral. And seriously, like this is even like sooner than the Great Depression happened, but like starting in 1927, it started becoming a known suicide spot. On top of that, serial killers Jack Unterweger and Richard Ramirez stayed there at some point. Eventually, it was renamed the Stay on Main in 2011 in hopes that it could break ties with its dark past. Unfortunately, when, so much like dark things happen in a place like that, it's hard to break away from it. Now, before we move on to like the incidents that I chose, I do want to at least acknowledge probably the most well-known case from it, at least in recent years. And that is the case of Elisa Lam. Now, I feel like I've mentioned this before, but this is not a case that I'm going to personally dive into on my podcast, mostly because like not only has it been covered time and time again, and like I also don't think I can bring anything new to the table, and on top of that, I remember reading somewhere that Elisa's mother has asked people to stop covering the case. So I want to respect that, like, first and foremost. So in case someone says like, oh, why didn't you touch on Elisa's case? It's mostly because I want to respect her mother's wishes and not cover the case anymore. Now, let's talk about the incidents that I decided to cover. Now, Wikipedia has an entire list of what of like notable incidents that have happened. So if you want to take like a closer look and do like all that, I will link the Wikipedia list in my show notes. So the earliest one that I could find is the case of Percy Ormond Cook. There's a lot, like I said, this was a very popular suicide spot. But Cook had ended up shooting himself in the head on January 22nd, 1927. In the letter, he stated that he was driven to this point because of his separation from his wife and family. And he also stated in the letter that he had thought about this for a week before committing the suicide. Next is W.K. Norton. He was found dead in his room on November 19th in 1931. This one was ruled a possible suicide because there was evidence that he had ingested poison pills. On top of that, he had checked into the Cecil a week prior to his death under the pseudonym of James Willies. So, evidence really does point to a suicide. However, I couldn't find any evidence of a suicide letter or any evidence that, of people saying, oh, yeah, he was very depressed around this time. But his death did occur in 1931 during the Great Depression. So, again, most of the evidence does point to suicide. The third one I chose is Benjamin Dodick. He was found dead in his room by a maid in September 1932 with a self-inflicted gunshot to the head. This one also had no suicide note left. And I also couldn't necessarily find an exact date of his death. Just the fact that he was found dead in his room in September of 32. The next one is Sergeant Louis D. Borden. He was also found dead in his room, but on July 26, 1934. He had slit his own throat with a razor and ended up leaving several notes. One note cited poor health for the reason for the suicide, but because there were several notes left, there was probably a few more examples that he gave. The next one is Grace E. Margot. She didn't actually die in her room, but she had been staying at the Cecil in March of 1937. She fell from a 9th-story window and had fallen, and her fall had been broken by telephone wires that wrapped around her body. She later died at the now demolished Georgia Street Receiving Hospital. It was undetermined whether the fall and subsequent death were due to a suicide attempt or just a very unfortunate accident. Next one is Roy Thompson. He also, to a certain extent, fell to his death. He specifically jumped from his hotel room on January 9th, 1938. He fell on top of a skylight on the next door building. The body was found by a hotel employee the very next day. They couldn't find any evidence of a note, but the death was ruled a suicide. I remember also reading that there was no evidence of any foul play. No one had entered his room or anything like that. Next is Erwin C. Neblett. He was found dead in his room in May 1939 after ingesting poison. I couldn't find any more information beyond the fact that he just ingested poison. And it was ruled a possible suicide due to the lack of note left. Now, this last one that I'm covering is potentially the second most well-known incident. And I say potentially because almost every podcast or show that I've watched that covers the Cecil Hotel has covered this person's case, at least to some extent, and that is the case of Pigeon Goldie Osgood. Her nickname came from the fact that she would care for the pigeons and other birds while staying at the Cecil. She ended up dying on June 4th, 1964. Her body was discovered by hotel staff and her room was ransacked. Goldie was stabbed and beaten, and there's also evidence to her being violated in a certain way. There's a man named Jacques B. Eilinger who was picked up for the murder because he was seen nearby in bloody clothes. He ended up being cleared of the crime due to lack of evidence, and I think the blood was determined to be animal blood and not human blood. And if it was determined to be human blood, I believe it was his. I can't rightly remember, but like the blood just like came back negative to matching Pigeon Goldie's. That's the point. So, and then like I've also heard stories of people like hearing movement in the halls when it's the dead of night. I've also heard stories of people like saying like they've seen another person rounding a corner, and then when they would like catch up to like where that person would have been, they're nowhere in sight. And like with how many like things have occurred at this hotel in general, and just like how negatively it's been impacted, I'd be surprised if there wasn't at least residual hauntings when it comes to this hotel. Now, I know this was like a very short episode, but like I said, I wanted to get something out despite the fact that there's like stuff going on in my personal life that I kind of need to take care of. But I will be back next weekend with another episode, or I guess technically this weekend because this is being posted on a Monday night. So yeah, I will talk to you guys hopefully on Saturday, no later than Sunday, with another episode. Please, please, please be safe out there, guys.